My name is Logan Carter. I'm 30 years old, a pararescue specialist with the United States Air Force. But before I earned that title, before I learned how to rappel from helicopters into enemy territory, stabilize shattered lungs under fire, or carry bleeding teammates through blazing sandstorms, I was just the mistake of the Carter family. That wasn't what they called me to my face, of course. No. We were far too civilized for that. But I felt it in the way my father sighed every time my name came up in dinner conversations, in the way my mother changed the subject whenever I mentioned anything outside of law or medicine, and in how my older brother Ryan never once asked what I actually did for a living. Because in the Carter household, you were either someone or you were wasting potential. My father, Dr. Benjamin Carter, is the head of cardiothoracic surgery at one of Seattle's most prestigious hospitals. My mother, a legal scholar who once guest lectured at Yale. My brother? Top of his class at Stanford Law, already making waves clerking for a federal judge. And me? Well, I like to fix broken engines, build first aid kits from scratch, and sneak out at night to train my body like I was preparing for a war no one else saw coming. I wasn't rebelling. I wasn't trying to be different. I just was. From the time I was 10, I knew I didn't belong in a courtroom or an operating room. I wanted movement, purpose. I wanted my life to mean something, not on paper, but in real time, when someone's heart had stopped beating and you only had seconds to bring them back. But in my house, if your accomplishments didn't come framed in mahogany or mailed in an Ivy League envelope, they didn't count. They never said it outright. But every time I showed up to a family dinner in my service fatigues instead of a tailored suit, it felt like I was walking in with mud on their white carpet. "Are you still doing that military thing?" my mother once asked, swirling wine in a crystal glass. "That military thing," I replied with a tight smile, "saved 3 people last week. One of them was a kid." She nodded, almost graciously, and said, "That's nice, dear. Your brother just won an award for his environmental law work. It's going to be in Forbes." That was the Carter way. Status over service. Image over impact. And I was the smudge on their polished family portrait. But that was before a mission in Kandahar, before the crash, before the 38 hours that would change everything, including how the President of the United States would one day look me in the eye and say, "You saved more Americans than you'll ever know." But I'm getting ahead of myself. It all started the day I told my parents I wasn't going to med school. I still remember the exact look on my father's face. He had just set his espresso cup down, precisely as always, when I said it. "I'm not applying to med school," I told them across the dining room table, my voice steady even as my palms sweated under the wood grain. "I've already signed the contract. I leave for Air Force basic training in 3 weeks." Silence. 3 long seconds. Then my father blinked. Once. Slowly. Like he was trying to compute whether I had just told a joke in terrible taste. My mother was the first to speak. "You what?" she whispered, almost like it hurt to form the words. "Is this because of your grades? Because we can get you into Johns Hopkins with the right—" "No," I said quickly. "It's not about grades, it's about purpose." My father leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and locked his eyes on mine like a surgeon examining a bad X-ray. "Purpose," he repeated, as though I'd just used the word incorrectly. "Logan, joining the military isn't purpose, it's what people do when they don't have one." My stomach turned, but I didn't look away. "I want to be a para-rescueman," I told them. "Combat medic, search and rescue. I'll be saving lives, Dad, just not in a hospital, in places where no one else can." You want to save lives in a war zone? My brother Ryan said, laughing dryly. What are you? Some kind of action movie cliche? Come on. You hate following rules. You wouldn't last 2 weeks. I've already passed the entry exams, I replied, more defensive than I wanted to sound. Physical and written. My mother pressed her fingers to her temple. What did we do wrong? Was it the pressure? Did we push you too hard? This isn't you, Logan. That was the part that hurt the most. This was exactly me. This was the version of myself I had never been allowed to explore. The version that ran toward chaos instead of away from it. The one that felt more alive carrying a medical pack in the field than sitting in a sterile classroom memorizing anatomy terms for the 5th time. I don't expect you to understand, I said finally, standing up. But I need you to hear me. I'm not lost. I'm not running. I've never been more sure of anything. My father didn't even stand. He just said one thing. You're throwing your life away. The next 3 weeks were the quietest of my life. No one in the family mentioned my departure. There was no dinner, no send-off, no hug goodbye. I packed my duffel bag while my brother practiced mock court arguments in the next room. My mother left a pamphlet for a last-minute MCAT prep course on my nightstand. And my father? He left the house early the morning I shipped out. Didn't even look back. Basic training was hell, but it was the kind of hell that strips away all the noise and leaves you with only what's real. We were pushed past exhaustion, past pain, past pride. The instructors didn't care if your dad was a Harvard surgeon or your mom wrote legal textbooks. They only cared if you could carry 200 pounds of gear up a mountain and still stabilize a bleeding artery under fire. And I could. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being measured against Ryan or expectations or academic titles. I was being measured by grit, endurance, precision, willpower, and I thrived. One instructor pulled me aside after a brutal endurance test. You've got that quiet fire, Carter, he said. Not the loud, cocky kind, the kind that keeps people alive when all hell breaks loose. That was the first time I felt like someone had truly seen me, not the version my parents wanted, but the version I actually was. I graduated in the top 5% of my PJ class, got my insignia, and was sent straight into the field. I didn't call home, and no one from home called me. Not when I made sergeant. Not when I got my first commendation. Not even when I was airlifted out of the desert with shrapnel in my arm after extracting a wounded pilot under fire. They didn't want to know. So I stopped trying to tell them until one day, the President of the United States told my story for me. But that moment, that reckoning, would come later. For now, I focused on the only thing that mattered, saving lives in places where no one else could. Kandahar was a name I'd heard in briefings, maps, and news reports. But nothing prepared me for the reality. The smell of scorched dirt, the air so dry it cracked your throat, the tension that never quite left your chest, even when you were back at base. Our unit had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Griffin for 3 weeks when we got the intel. A group of American aid workers, 3 civilians and 1 translator, had been taken by a hostile cell and were being moved deep into the mountains. It was supposed to be a clean op, night insertion, extraction under an hour. But the enemy always gets a vote. I was the assigned para-rescueman on the mission. 12 of us boarded the twin Blackhawks under moonless skies, our faces painted, gear checked a dozen times over. I'd done med checks on my team before liftoff. I knew every blood type, every allergy, every past injury. These men were more than teammates, they were brothers. 32 minutes after takeoff, we took fire. The explosion hit the tail rotor. The bird lurched sideways like a dying beast. I didn't scream, I didn't even breathe. I just braced, clenched my jaw, and prayed we wouldn't die in a flaming spiral. We crash-landed in a valley far from the extraction point. The other chopper had circled wide and avoided the worst of it, but ours was shredded. And now we were isolated, outnumbered, and pinned down. I came to with my shoulder slammed into the wall of the wreckage. My helmet cracked, but intact. Blood ran down my arm. Someone was groaning. Fire licked at the back compartment. "Medic!" someone yelled. That word, yelled in that voice, was the switch. I grabbed my pack. Sergeant Lane had a chunk of shrapnel in his thigh, bleeding fast. I tied off a tourniquet, injected morphine, and got him behind cover. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Foster, had a collapsed lung. I performed a needle decompression behind the burning chopper with nothing but a penlight in my teeth and gunfire overhead. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt focused. Over the next 38 hours, we held that position. 12 of us against what intel would later confirm to be over 30 enemy combatants. I worked like a machine, stitching wounds under moonlight, dragging bodies through dust and gunfire, using myself as a shield when needed. I radioed coordinates for an airstrike after crawling to the edge of the ridge with a sniper rifle in my lap and a bullet grazing my helmet. The strike bought us time, but not safety. Then came the grenade. It exploded 5 feet from me. Shrapnel ripped into my left leg. I thought I'd gone deaf for a moment. My vision swam, but someone screamed, and I forced myself to move. Sergeant Blake was down, his chest caved in, barely breathing. I dragged him behind a boulder with one arm, my own leg numb, and started a chest seal, whispering over and over, "Stay with me, man. Don't quit on me now." I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I ran out of fluids. I chewed gauze to stay awake. On the second night, Captain Harrow made the call. We'd split up. I was tasked with leading 3 of the most wounded toward the eastern ridge, where a secondary pickup might be possible. We hiked through the dark, no lights, no sound but our own breathing and the occasional cough of pain. Every step sent fire through my thigh, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. We reached the ridge 48 hours after the crash. The Black Hawk came like a ghost, silent, smooth, salvation with rotors. We lifted off with 6 people on board, 4 of them alive, only because I didn't stop moving. Back at base, I collapsed. When I woke up in this field hospital, a nurse smiled gently and said, "You were out for 18 hours. You're lucky." I didn't feel lucky. One of the men I'd dragged through the dust, Sergeant Blake, had died en route. I cried for the first time in years. Quiet, angry tears. But when my CO handed me a sealed letter marked Classified Level 3, I realized the mission wasn't over. The intel I'd transmitted during those hours had helped stage a second raid, one that saved not just the original hostages, but 24 additional captives from another cell. None of that can be made public yet, my CO told me. But Command knows. The brass knows. Hell, even the White House knows. I nodded, numb. When I called home to tell my parents I'd been injured, my mother's first words were, "Will this affect your long-term mobility?" My father asked, "So? You still planning to re-enlist?" And just like that, the world I'd risked everything for was invisible again, at least to them, but not for long, because someone at the Pentagon hadn't forgotten my name, and neither had the President of the United States. 3 weeks after the mission, I was still limping. My leg had healed enough for me to walk without crutches, but the stiffness lingered. Some days I'd catch myself reaching for a cane that wasn't there. Phantom habits from phantom wounds. I was back on base at Lackland when the call came. I was finishing a slow jog around the perimeter, sweat burning through my shirt, when my CO flagged me down. "Carter!" he barked. "Pentagon wants you. They're patching through in my office. Now!" I wiped my face with my sleeve, heart pounding. Not from exertion, but something deeper. You don't get casual calls from the Pentagon. The voice on the line was calm, crisp, like it had never stumbled over a word in its life. "Sergeant Logan Carter," it said. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Meyer from the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force. You are being formally recognized for valor in combat." There was a pause, intentional, I think, before he continued. "You are to report to the White House next Thursday at 1400 hours. Dress uniform. You will receive the Distinguished Service Cross in a private ceremony hosted by the President of the United States." I froze. The Distinguished Service Cross? That wasn't some local commendation or a unit patch. That was the second highest military award in the entire Army and Air Force, only below the Medal of Honor. I swallowed hard. Sir, I didn't do anything extraordinary. I was just doing my job." Another pause. "That's what they all say, Sergeant. And that's exactly why you're being recognized." He hung up after giving me further instructions, but I barely heard them. I sat there in the office, still in my sweat-soaked PT gear, staring at the dead phone line like it might ring again. And then came the question I couldn't avoid. Do I tell them? That night, I sat in my bunk and typed the message out more than a dozen times. "Mom? Dad? I've been invited to the White House. Ryan, I'm getting a medal. Not that you care, but still. Dear family, despite your best efforts, I'm not a failure after all. Delete, delete, delete." Finally, I typed something simple. "I'm receiving a Distinguished Service Cross from the President at the White House next Thursday at 2 p.m. You're welcome to attend if you'd like." No flourish, no emotion. Just facts. I hit send before I could second guess it. The reply came 6 hours later, from my mother. "We'll check our schedules. Your father has a faculty meeting that day. We'll let you know." No congratulations, no "we're proud of you," just a scheduling conflict. I almost laughed out loud. The part that hurt most wasn't their hesitation. It was that I'd expected it, that I had hoped, despite everything, that this might be the moment they finally looked at me and saw someone worth acknowledging. Instead, they treated it like an optional dentist appointment. Days passed. No word from them. Meanwhile, my entire unit lit up when they found out. My squad leader, Captain Harrow, clapped me on the back and said, "You earned this, man. Don't let anyone tell you different." The guys pooled money and got my dress blues tailored. Even the base barbershop stayed open late so I could get a fresh cut. These weren't blood relatives, but they were family. And when the day came, Thursday, 2:00 p.m., they stood taller for me than my real family ever had. But just before we left for the airport, my phone buzzed. "We're coming. Your father rearranged his meeting. Ryan and Charlotte will be there too." That was it. Not even a "see you soon." Still, I stared at the message for a long time, not sure how to feel. Angry? Relieved? Hollow? All I knew was this: they would be in the room. And for once, they would have to listen. Washington, D.C. welcomed me with clear skies and polished marble. The East Room of the White House gleamed with gold-trimmed elegance, full of uniforms, medals, quiet conversations, and a kind of reverent energy I couldn't quite explain. I stood at attention, chest squared, ribbons in place. And across the room, I saw them. My parents, my brother, and his fiancée, dressed to perfection, sitting near the back like spectators at a play they didn't fully understand. What they didn't know was this: This wasn't a performance. This wasn't for show. This was the moment the world would hear the story they refused to believe for years. And the President of the United States was about to tell it for me. The East Room was still. Even with the quiet rustle of dress uniforms, the low murmur of aides and dignitaries, and the distant click of a press photographer's camera, everything felt suspended, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stood in the front row with 3 other honorees, each of us in full dress, our names soon to be spoken by the Commander-in-Chief. A military aide stepped forward and began reading our citations, each a story of chaos, courage, and control when everything else fell apart. Mine was last. The aide's voice was clear, steady, practiced. Sergeant Logan Carter distinguished himself by exceptionally valorous conduct in the face of the enemy while serving as a para-rescue specialist assigned to the 22nd Special Tactics Squadron. I heard the words, but they felt like they were about someone else. During a mission in hostile territory, after his aircraft was downed by enemy fire, Sergeant Carter, despite suffering injuries, provided life-saving care to multiple wounded teammates while under sustained enemy engagement for over 38 hours. There was a pause. My eyes shifted, just for a second, toward the back of the room. My father had leaned forward. My mother's lips were slightly parted, frozen. Ryan wasn't smirking for once. His brows were furrowed, confused, like he'd just realized he missed an entire chapter of my life. Sergeant Carter's actions directly saved the lives of 6 U.S. personnel. Intelligence he gathered under duress contributed to the successful rescue of 27 additional hostages and the disruption of multiple coordinated attacks on U.S. interests. I looked straight ahead again, but I felt the weight of their silence like gravity. Then the President stood. He walked toward me slowly, deliberately, citation in one hand, medal in the other, and then he looked me dead in the eyes and said, his voice unwavering, "Sergeant Carter didn't just rescue his team. He made decisions under fire that saved civilians, protected American lives, and dismantled threats that may never make the headlines, but will always matter." He placed the medal around my neck. "Sergeant Carter, on behalf of a grateful nation, thank you." Then, in a move that was not part of protocol, he leaned in and said quietly, so only I could hear, "My godson was one of the civilians your intel saved. He's alive today because of you." I swallowed hard, nodding, but couldn't speak. He took a step back. Saluted. The room erupted into applause. But not from the corner where my family sat. They were still frozen. At the reception that followed, generals, cabinet members, and fellow soldiers came to shake my hand. I stood beside a display of photos from the mission. Blurry night vision images, maps, unit patches, and still, they hadn't approached me. It wasn't until a State Department official brought over 3 civilians, 2 men and a woman, who had been rescued during the second raid that the moment cracked open. The woman, probably in her early 40s, hugged me tightly without asking. "I have a daughter," she whispered into my ear. "She still has her mom because of you." I felt her tears on my shoulder. When she pulled away, I noticed my mother standing just 10 feet away, watching, eyes glassy, mouth trembling. She didn't approach. Not yet. But I saw her hand move instinctively to her heart. Eventually they came. First my brother. He walked up slowly, hands in his pockets, suit crisp, tie expensive. "Logan," he said, voice unusually quiet. "I didn't know. I never—" "No," I cut in, not harshly, just firmly. "You never asked." He nodded, biting his lip. "That was a mistake." Then my mother stepped forward, For a moment, she just stared at the medal on my chest. "When they described the helicopter crash," she began, her voice shaking, "and how you were wounded and still treated the others." She didn't finish. I just nodded once. "That happened." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know. I couldn't imagine." "I tried to tell you," I said. "Once. On the phone. You said I probably tripped over a tent stake." She winced. Her eyes filled. "I'm sorry." Behind her, my father stood stiffly, always the last to speak. "I've spent decades in academia," he finally said. "I've been respected, admired even. But the way those generals looked at you today—" He paused. "I've never earned that kind of respect from anyone." We stood there for a beat too long. I didn't embrace them, didn't cry, didn't smile. I just said, "Now you see." And then I turned and walked toward the other honorees, toward my squad, toward the people who had always seen. The cameras were gone, the medal was heavy on my chest, and the room felt a little too polished, a little too clean. I needed to breathe. I slipped away from the reception and walked down a quiet hallway toward the service exit. My boots echoed on the marble floor like a slow, stubborn drumbeat. I wasn't running, but I wasn't staying either. "Thought I'd find you out here," a voice said behind me. I turned. It was Staff Sergeant Marcus Tex Harrow, my old squad leader, newly promoted and still walking like the weight of every mission we'd been on was stitched into his spine. "Couldn't take all the handshakes," I muttered. He gave a low chuckle. "You were always more about action than applause." I nodded, eyes scanning the empty hallway. It felt surreal, standing there, like the version of me they honored didn't exist in their eyes until someone important told them it mattered. He didn't need to ask who they were. Tex knew. He clapped me on the shoulder. "Come to O'Malley's tonight. The team's gathering. No cameras. Just beer and people who never needed a press release to know who you are." I smiled. "Yeah, I'll be there." That night, we filled the back room of O'Malley's, an Irish dive bar not far from Arlington. It smelled like spilled whiskey and burnt fries. The lighting was bad, the furniture worse. But it felt like home. The guys raised their glasses when I walked in, a raucous cheer rising like an anthem. "To Sergeant Carter!" someone yelled. "To the man who dragged 3 bleeding bastards across enemy lines on one leg," another added. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months, maybe years. It wasn't just the alcohol. It was the fact that I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to downplay the medal or justify the limp or pretend I was okay. Because they knew. They'd seen the same things, lost people they loved, heard the same hollow silence after the firefights ended. We didn't talk about the ceremony, not really. We told dumb stories, roasted each other, ordered too many wings. But at one point, Sergeant Ali leaned in and asked quietly, "So, what now for you?" I shrugged. "Not sure. I've got a month of medical leave left. Then maybe redeploy, or maybe instruct." He looked me over. "You're not done, are you?" "No," I said softly. "But I'm done pretending I'm not tired." A week later, I requested reassignment to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. They were short-staffed in the Wounded Warrior Program, rehab, physical therapy, trauma care. They needed someone who had been there, and I needed something that didn't look like war, but still meant something. I traded desert boots for scrubs, body armor for latex gloves. But I didn't stop being a soldier. At Walter Reed, I saw pain that didn't bleed. Saw men learning to walk again with one leg. Women staring at phantom limbs like they might still answer. I saw what war leaves behind, and for the first time, I started to heal. One of my regulars was Captain James Rodriguez, a Marine who'd lost both legs to an IED outside Fallujah. His file said resistant to therapy, but on our third session, he grunted through a grimace and asked, "You ever lost someone? In your arms?" I looked him in the eye. "Yeah, more than once." He nodded. "Then you get it." After that, he showed up early for every session. No excuses, no lies. We trained, we talked. Sometimes we didn't talk at all, but we understood. And for the first time, I felt useful without a rifle. I got invited to speak at a military medical conference 6 weeks later. It was strange, standing in a suit instead of a uniform, presenting innovations in field trauma response instead of kicking down doors. But when I spoke, people listened. They weren't clapping for heroism, they were clapping for knowledge. And for once, I felt like maybe, just maybe, both parts of me could coexist, the warrior and the healer. But the real surprise came 3 months into the new assignment. One Saturday afternoon, someone buzzed my apartment intercom in San Antonio. "Logan, it's Dad." I froze. He'd never come unannounced. He barely called. I opened the door. He stood there in jeans and a windbreaker, looking older. Not weak, but not towering either. "I was in town for a lecture," he said. "I was wondering if you'd show me around." I didn't speak at first, just opened the door wider. Maybe he wasn't here to fix anything. Maybe he'd never understand. But he had shown up, and that was more than he ever had before. We didn't talk much in the car. My dad sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in his lap, staring out the window as if the streets of San Antonio held answers he hadn't been able to find in any book. I didn't fill the silence. I'd spent years chasing his approval. I wasn't about to hand him comfort now, just because he showed up. Still, a part of me couldn't believe this was happening. "Walter Reed," I finally said, as we pulled into the parking lot. "Not exactly an Ivy League campus, but the people here? Some of the smartest I've ever met." He gave a faint nod. "I'm looking forward to seeing it." I doubted that, but I let him have the words. The front desk staff greeted me like usual, with the kind of casual respect that only came from shared purpose, not titles. I guided him through the main rehabilitation wing, where soldiers moved through physical therapy with prosthetics, braces, or visible pain etched into every step. He watched quietly as I stopped to check in on Captain Rodriguez. The former Marine greeted me with a sarcastic smirk and a fist bump. "This your dad?" he asked, glancing over. "It is." Rodriguez extended a hand. "Hell of a son you've got." My father shook his hand, a little stiffly, but didn't say much. We continued on. I showed him the hydrotherapy room, the group trauma counseling center, the corner where I'd started my own peer support program. Finally, I walked him into one of the smaller simulation labs, where I'd been helping develop new trauma training modules for incoming medics. "This," I said, "is where I teach them what no textbook can. How to treat a sucking chest wound in the back of a moving truck. How to keep someone alive when you're out of blood, out of time, and out of options." He didn't say anything at first. Then, almost reluctantly, "How do you teach that?" I turned to face him. "By showing them what it looks like to do it with your hands shaking. By telling them the truth, that fear doesn't make you weak. Freezing does. And the only way you don't freeze is if you've trained harder than the chaos coming at you." He looked at me with something unfamiliar. Not pity, not pride exactly, but curiosity. Like he was seeing me, really seeing me, for the first time. We went for coffee at the hospital cafeteria afterward. No suits, no stage. Just two men with tired eyes and more history than they knew what to do with. "I owe you an apology," he said, stirring cream into his cup. For everything. But mostly for assuming that a degree made a man and anything else was failure. I didn't reply right away. I let the silence stretch, not to punish him, but because some truths deserve space. I used to think that too, I said quietly, that I had to prove something, that medals or rank would change how you saw me. He looked down. And now? Now I know I don't need your permission to matter. He flinched, but nodded. I was scared, he admitted. When you enlisted, I thought I was protecting you by discouraging it. But really, I just didn't have the courage to watch you walk into the fire. I let out a slow breath. That fire made me who I am, I said. It didn't break me, but silence almost did. He nodded again, slower this time. You're braver than I ever was, Logan. Not because of medals, but because you kept going, even when we didn't go with you. For the first time in years, I believed he meant it. As we left, one of the new recruits I'd been mentoring walked by, barely 19, still in training fatigues. She saluted me with nervous respect. My father watched, then asked, How old were you when you knew this was your path? I thought for a moment. When I was 11, I said. You brought home that photo of Grandpa in his combat medic uniform. You said he didn't like to talk about the war. But I couldn't stop looking at his eyes in that photo. That look in them. It stayed with me. He paused. I didn't know that. You never asked. That night I stood by my apartment window, metal case still unopened on the table. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother. Your dad told me about the tour. He cried, Logan. He never cries. And then another. I'm sorry it took us so long to understand. I didn't reply. Not yet. But I smiled. Because understanding, however late, still meant something. It was my therapist's idea. Invite them, she said one afternoon, her pen hovering just above the notebook. Not for confrontation, for clarity. You've carried their silence long enough. I hesitated. Family therapy? It sounded like something other people did. People who hadn't been shot at, dragged teammates through gunfire, or watched men die under their hands. But then again, maybe that's exactly why it was time. So I asked, just once, a single text. Would you both be willing to come to one session with me? 1 hour. That's all I ask. They said yes. We met in a quiet office near Walter Reed, the kind with soft chairs and neutral tones, like it was designed not to provoke too much of anything. The therapist was calm, middle-aged, unflinching. Her name was Dr. Wells. She began simply. This isn't a courtroom or a hospital. This is a space to say things that have gone unsaid. Logan, would you like to begin? I took a breath, then another. Then I looked directly at my parents and said, You grieved the future you imagined for me louder than you ever celebrated the one I actually lived. My mother's eyes welled instantly. My father looked like someone had punched him in the gut. I needed you, I continued, voice steady but low. Not to save me, not to rescue me from war, just to ask, just to care. Just once. There was silence. Then my mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I was terrified, Logan. From the moment you enlisted, I lived with constant dread. Every news headline, every casualty report felt like it might be you. I couldn't bear it. So I told myself you were safe, that you weren't really in danger. Pretending you were just doing your job was the only way I could sleep. I blinked. Hard. It wasn't malice. It had never been malice. It was fear. Unspoken. Unprocessed. I understand now, she said, that my denial became your abandonment. Dr. Wells nodded gently, then turned to my father. And you, Dr. Carter? He stared down at his hands, knuckles tight, mouth pressed into a thin line. When my father came back from Vietnam, he said slowly, he was broken, quiet, angry. He never talked about it, but he would stare off sometimes, and we knew he was somewhere else entirely. I'd never heard this story. He was a medic too, my dad continued, like you. I watched war consume him from the inside out. I swore I'd never let my children walk into that same fire. His voice cracked. But I didn't stop you, Logan. And when you went, I hated myself for not stopping you, so I turned that hate outward. I dismissed your service, mocked your choices, not because I didn't respect you, but because if I acknowledged your danger, I'd have to admit I was powerless to protect you. The room was quiet, except for my mother's quiet sobbing. I sat back, let the words settle. Then I spoke, not as a soldier, but as a son. I never needed protecting, Dad. I just needed to not feel alone. I carried wounded men out of battle, but the heaviest burden I ever shouldered was knowing that when I called home, no one asked what I'd been through. My father nodded. Tears slid down his face. It was the first time I'd ever seen him cry. We didn't leave that office hugging and healed. There was no movie-style breakthrough, but we left different, less armored, more real. In the following weeks, something shifted. My mother called more often, just to ask how I was feeling, not what I was doing. She sent photos of my grandfather's medals, framed them, said, "We should have displayed these years ago." My father started emailing me research articles on combat trauma, military medicine, and even adaptive therapy for amputee soldiers. It wasn't his way of teaching me. It was his way of catching up. Ryan sent a text, too. "Been volunteering at a veterans clinic. You were right all along." No fluff, no guilt, just truth. One Sunday morning, I opened a box my mother had mailed. Inside, newspaper clippings from the White House ceremony, a photo of me in uniform standing next to the president, and something new. A shadow box. It held my Distinguished Service Cross, my unit patch, and beneath it, a plaque that read, "To our son, you didn't need to earn our pride, but you have it. Forever." For a long time, I just sat there holding it in my hands. Not because I needed their approval, but because even warriors need home. And for the first time, I had one. Thanksgiving came quietly that year. It was the first time I'd gone home for the holidays since before my deployment. The Carter house hadn't changed. Still pristine, still too quiet, still filled with books and silence that stretched between rooms like cobwebs no one dared sweep away. But something had changed. And that something sat across the dinner table from me, carving turkey in a fleece pullover instead of a starched dress shirt. My father. He wasn't pretending anymore. He asked about my physical therapy patients, listened when I spoke, even laughed genuinely. When I told a story about a prosthetic leg launching off the treadmill mid-session and nearly knocking over a colonel, it was strange. Good, but strange. Later that night, he asked if I could help him find a book in his study. Something about post-combat psychological resilience he'd misplaced. "Second shelf, blue spine," he said, pointing. I was scanning titles when I noticed the drawer in his desk was slightly open. Not enough to invite snooping, just enough to catch my eye. Inside, tucked between folders and old manila envelopes, was something that didn't belong. A weathered military recruitment brochure. Folded, creased, edges yellowed with time. It was dated 1972, Air Force Medical Corps, and scribbled in the margins in a younger version of my father's handwriting were notes. Physical cleared. Signed by end of semester. Talk to Dad again? I turned slowly. He was standing in the doorway, silent. You were going to enlist? I asked. He stepped inside, his expression somewhere between guilt and nostalgia. I was all set to join after undergrad, he said. Passed the physical. Had the paperwork ready. Even told the recruiter I'd see him the following Monday. What happened? My father happened, he replied. He sat me down one night and said, I've seen enough Mitchell men come back from war with nothing left in their eyes. He didn't yell. He just asked me not to go. My chest tightened. He'd served in Korea, came back changed, harder, colder. I think he was afraid I'd lose something I wouldn't know how to get back. So you went into medicine? He nodded. Went to med school instead. Got married. Had you. Built a good life. A safe one. I studied his face. For the first time, the pieces clicked. All the resentment, all the silence, all the dismissive comments about the military, about my choices. It hadn't been just about me. It had been about him. About the path he didn't take. And the son who had the courage to walk it anyway. I think I was hard on you, he said, voice low, because I envied you. You stepped into something I was too afraid to face. And instead of admiring that, I punished you for it. I closed the drawer, walked over, and for the first time since I was a child, I hugged my father. Not stiffly, not out of duty, but with everything we'd both carried for decades. I'm glad you told me, I whispered. I should have told you a long time ago, he replied. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I wandered into the living room. For years, that room had been a shrine to my brother's law degrees, my parents' academic awards, and carefully curated certificates. My photos had always been absent. But now, there they were. A photo of me at Walter Reed, standing with my team. A framed news article about the Distinguished Service Cross ceremony. And in the center, a glass case. Inside, my Purple Heart, my unit patch, and my grandfather's dog tags, now resting beside mine. There was a handwritten card at the bottom of the display. 3 generations, same courage, different paths, one purpose. We never had the kind of family that said, I'm proud of you, out loud. But that glass case, that was louder than words. And I finally understood. The validation I craved wasn't just about recognition, it was about connection, legacy, belonging. 6 months after the ceremony, I was promoted again. Not because of the medal, not even because of the press, but because I'd found a new rhythm, training young medics at the Air Force Medical Education and Training Campus. My title wasn't flashy, instructor, tactical field care, and trauma response. But for me, it meant everything. I wasn't patching up wounds on the battlefield anymore. I was teaching others how not to freeze, how to stay calm with a teammate bleeding out, how to trust their hands when the world was burning around them. And maybe more than anything, I was teaching them why it mattered. One afternoon, after a long session running live drills in the simulation yard, I was packing up when I noticed one of the younger recruits, slight frame, buzz cut, maybe 19, lingering by the doorway. She looked nervous, almost reverent. Something on your mind, Airman? I asked, not unkindly. She stepped forward, clutching a notebook to her chest. I wanted to say thank you, Sergeant Carter. I raised an eyebrow. For what? She took a shaky breath. Your story. I read about you, the mission in Kandahar, the ceremony at the White House. You were on the news." I tensed, partly out of discomfort, partly out of reflex. She went on. "My older brother served. He didn't make it home. I always wondered if I could ever live up to him. But when I saw what you did and how quiet you were about it, I realized it's not about the medals. It's about showing up, over and over again." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. "I joined because of you," she added. "I want to save lives too." I cleared my throat, then looked her dead in the eye and said, "The medals don't make the medic. The willingness to run toward the wounded when everyone else is running away. That's what makes you who you are." She stood a little straighter, smiled, then walked off into the hallway, disappearing into the sea of trainees. And I just sat there for a long time, letting her words echo. That night, back in my apartment, I pulled out the glass box my parents had made. I opened it slowly, held the Distinguished Service Cross in my hand, felt the weight of it, not just the medal, but everything it carried. The 38 hours in the valley, the men I'd saved, the one I couldn't, the silence from my family, the president's salute, the tears my father never meant me to see, the tattered recruitment brochure from 1972. And now, the fire in the eyes of a new generation who would one day carry someone else through chaos and say, "Stay with me. I've got you." I'd spent years thinking value came from outside, from medals, titles, acknowledgement. But I'd learned something far more powerful. Recognition doesn't create worth, it only reveals it. And the people who once couldn't see it, maybe they weren't meant to, until I saw it for myself. These days, I still limp a little when it rains, still wake up some nights from dreams I can't always explain. But I'm no longer waiting for someone else to validate the road I walked. I am the validation. Every soldier I train, every scar I carry, every life I touched, seen or unseen. And as I stood in the back of the classroom the next morning, watching another group of wide-eyed recruits take their first step into something bigger than themselves, I realized something simple, something strong. I never needed to prove I was worth something. I just needed to live it, loudly, quietly, and completely.